friends, it's Michael Parker, and welcome back. Today's guest is Dr. Richard Gallagher. He is a board-certified psychiatrist. He's a professor of psychiatry at New York Medical and a psychoanalyst on the faculty of Columbia University. He graduated from Princeton University, Phi Beta Kappa in classics, and trained as a resident in psychiatry at Yale University School of Medicine. He is also considered the world's foremost scientific expert on the subject of diabolic attacks. He has been an active member of the International Association of Exorcists since the 1990s. Dr. Gallagher, thank you for joining me today.
Well, thanks for the invitation, Mr. Parker.
I've been listening to your interviews, I've been reading the book, and one of the things you're very upfront about is that you were initially apprehensive to get into the subject, and I get that. I understand from an academic's point of view, when you're dealing with controversial subjects like this, it would be debatable whether you'd want to do it, but it's commendable you decided to do it. My question, though, I know that you're a man of faith, of Catholic faith. I'm a Christian as well. So I guess, were you a little scared? Because I'll be honest, I don't know if I want to be in the room with an exorcism.
Well, my original attitude, it wasn't so much apprehension as skepticism. And I don't mean, since I was brought up Catholic, I don't mean that, I didn't believe in God or I didn't accept that probably there was a realm of the demonic. But I had been trained at Yale, as you mentioned, during a time when we had what we call in this country, it was a common term then, the Satanic Panic.
Yes.
In other words, everybody was finding Satanists all over the place. There were even people who were writing books with made-up stories about Satanists, and there were false accusations. And of course, also as a psychiatrist, I was aware that there were psychotic people or people with dissociative identity disorder, which we used to call multiple personality, who only imagined they were attacked by evil spirits. So overall, I was a little skeptical of a lot of these reports. And the way I got into this field, and I always tell people, I never really volunteered to get involved in this field. And I'm not sure it is a good idea to volunteer, but that's a whole nother subject. There's somewhat, obviously very intelligent and experienced priest exorcist came to my office. I was at Cornell Medical College at the time as an attending psychiatrist. I had finished my residency. And he came into my office sort of out of the blue, and he said, Dr. Gallagher, I believe you're a Catholic, and I was wondering if you would be willing to help us evaluate a case that we think is demonic. And we get these cases, and we often need a doctor to help us discern, although a lot of exorcists can do that on their own. And I said to the gentleman, a very pleasant, and it turned out erudite man, I said, well, look, Father, with all due respect, I'm a little skeptical of all this stuff, or a lot of this stuff, put it that way. And he gave me a smile and he said, well, then, Dr. Gallagher, you're the perfect man for the job, which I found refreshing, that he wanted someone who, was not only scientifically trained, but comes into a case with a little bit of skepticism. And then it was kind of off to the races. I mean, he showed me a case. It was a woman who was getting beaten up literally by evil spirits, as I came to believe. We did some tests on her. She didn't have any medical disorder. She didn't have any disorder with platelets or anything like that. She was not in any way mentally disturbed. And I had to eventually conclude and say to this priest, in the book, I call him, I wrote a book about my experiences. In the book, I use pseudonyms for everybody, including for him, although a lot of people, quite frankly, know who he is. But unless I get permission from somebody, that includes the victims, I always use pseudonyms, even though every detail in the book, which is called Demonic Foes, is accurate. So I wound up saying to this priest exorcist, who was one of the few at the time. I mean, this isn't that long ago, but there were not a lot of Catholic official exorcists at the time in America. And I said, well, look, Father, I cannot find any medical, and I had been trained in internal medicine as well a little bit. I can't find any medical or psychiatric reason why this person claims that she's getting these attacks by evil spirits. And he said, thank you, Dr. Gallagher. That's what we sort of assumed. We assumed this was not a woman who was possessed, but we assumed that this was what we call an oppression, which is a kind of attenuated demonic attack, short of a possession. And then after that, he and his colleague, a big ex-Marine from New England, who, as exorcists, were seeing cases all across the country. They would take me on cases. I would help them evaluate cases. Eventually, Mr. Parker, I was invited to join the International Association of Exorcists as a kind of scientific advisor. I was asked to write some articles. I was eventually invited by HarperCollins. I was delighted to write a book about my experience. And then, believe it or not, Hollywood started knocking, and there's one character in the book who was one of these genuine but rare Satanists who presents a remarkable story, and Hollywood wants to make a movie out of that. And keep my fingers crossed, I decided I would do that too. So I've gotten very involved at the field, while at the same time serving as a very mainstream, typical board-certified psychiatrist.
We are going to discuss that story in the book. And yes, I apologize. I was remiss. I didn't say the title of the book in the introduction. It is Demonic Foes, My 25 Years as a Psychiatrist Investigating Possessions, Diabolic Attacks, and the Paranormal. You've said there are people with mental problems who think they are possessed, and the reverse. And a skeptic could say, yeah, okay, a person says they're possessed, they probably just have mental issues. But what about the person who is possessed who thinks they have mental issues, the reverse?
Well, when these odd experiences come upon people, depending on their religious background, depending on their cultural background, they're gonna have a personal interpretation of it before they eventually, seek help. And if they, especially, let's say they are atheist or agnostic or something, they're often very mystified why these strange things are happening to them, and what kind of strange things am I discussing? I mean, at the extreme, they may go into a trance. A voice may come out of them. That voice may seem to be a different personality. It's often associated with really what you might call paranormal stuff, where the person has superhuman strength or can reveal hidden details about people's lives, or in a good example of many cases that I've seen, they will start speaking a foreign language. Mm-hmm. Now, most demonic cases don't rise to the level of what I just described as a possession. Most demonic cases are people who feel attacked in some more limited way, but they too are going to be mystified. They may be feeling physically attacked in some way, scratched or beaten, like the woman example I gave, or choked even, or they may have some huge sensory interference in their life. Now, depending on their religious and cultural background, some people are going to get very confused about that. Other people will jump quickly to, well, this must be some kind of evil spirit, especially if they're brought up religious. So you have to meet the person where they are. And in some ways, it's harder with a person who doesn't have a belief in demons or God or our Lord, because they're more confused mm-hmm. than a religious person because they really have no idea what's going on. A lot of those people sort of learn about this whole realm in a very painful way. A lot of them eventually, become religious themselves because the experience is so powerful. And as I say to my psychiatric colleagues, how many mentally ill people do you know who all of a sudden can speak perfect Latin or something, can throw a clergy person clear across a room who's trying to pray over them, or in very rare situations, can even levitate during an exorcism or something. I mean, this clearly, in my view, and I think in the view of an objective person, goes beyond just the psychiatric. And that's what I get called in to help discern, that some cases are trickier and harder to discern.
When you're talking about levitating, you would think that the scientific community would be all over that, because regardless of how it's happening, that defies all logic and is impossible by our understanding of physics. So that's just a remarkable thing. And I understand that you said that you have never personally witnessed it, but I think you've had 30 to 40 eyewitness accounts of this.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, it does contradict the laws of science. And I am a scientist. I mean, I couldn't be a physician and a very well-trained psychiatrist if I didn't believe in science. I believe in
Yes.
the Big Bang and all this,
Yes.
this scientific stuff. I'm not a scientific skeptic.
Right.
I would say, like miracles throughout history, sometimes there are spiritual realities that are non-material, that go beyond what a naturalistic science. Science operates by what we call, to get technical for a minute, methodological naturalism. It assumes that everything has a kind of material cause, and it's been a very valuable tool in modern science to be able to do experiments using those principles. But our knowledge of things is, in fact, most of our knowledge is historical. And historical knowledge, knowing that George Washington crossed the Delaware, or that Abraham Lincoln proclaim the Emancipation Proclamation. I mean, historical knowledge is knowledge too, and in fact, it's most of what we know about our family, our friends. So there are different types of knowledge. What I say is the evidence that I give, which I think is pretty powerful, although you don't have to believe me. There are plenty of other people who have written books about this. The evidence is very powerful, and it's historical. It's anecdotal, you might say, but it's pretty well documented, and that is a type of knowledge too. In fact, the word science originally comes from the Latin. It means knowledge. In modern times, we've associated science, appropriately so, with certain principles of studies and replicability, that sort of thing. But that's not our only kind of knowledge. And I believe that the things I describe in the book with a lot of detail, which is why I wrote the book, also count as a type of knowledge.
Before we get to the person in the book that you call Julia, which I think is what Blumhouse is going to make their film about. I believe that's the case that they're covering. I wanted to ask you something, because I've had a great deal of experience also with so-called psychics, mediums, clairvoyants. I'm a seeker. I've looked into a lot of things. And when you're talking about levels of possession and some of this perhaps being oppression, it made me think of the idea, because I've heard this from some of these people I just mentioned, is possession by demons, is it by definition a parasitic relationship?
Most people who are possessed, because I don't want to give the impression that this sort of thing just happens out of the blue.
Right. No, I understand.
They have in some ways, in the vast majority of cases, there are a few exceptions, but in the vast majority of cases, they have somehow, wittingly or not, invited the demon in. Now, how have they done that? Well, some, like the woman I call in the book by the pseudonym Julia, was one of these rare outright Satanists. And so she worshiped Satan. She obviously, in some ways, invited a demon upon her, which even though she worshipped and felt that Satan gave her favors, these people are not necessarily crazy. They think they get something out of being a Satanist,
Of
otherwise
course.
they wouldn't become a Satanist. But she didn't bargain, you could say a literal Faustian bargain. She didn't bargain with getting possessed, and she wanted not to be possessed. But she sort of wanted to have her cake and eat it too. So in some ways, she had explicitly invited the demonic world into her life. Other people don't necessarily do it so explicitly. They may do it through certain superstitious practices where they're attempting to gain knowledge, but they don't understand that the knowledge they're gaining, like people who use tarot cards as an example, these different occult practices, they are, in a sense, again, not necessarily consciously, but they're turning to a realm that is hostile to them. And it's sort of like turning to the mafia. Once the mafia does a favor for you, they feel they own you. And so you've kind of opened the door, to use the phrase, to them exacting some kind of revenge. I don't know that I would use the word parasitical so much as rapacious. They sometimes literally rapacious, but they feel in a way that they have a right to own or at least seriously attack a person to whom they feel someone has committed themselves. And that may be it also may be simply by very evil actions. For instance, I write about a guy in the book who was a gangster, and he knew darn well that he had turned to evil, and he became possessed. Now, in his case, he eventually returned to his original Catholic faith, got delivered, whereas the Satanist woman I write about, by contrast, she wanted to have her cake and eat it too, as I said, and she was also afraid of the cult. She was afraid the cult would harm her. So she never really renounced her beliefs and her lifestyle, and almost automatically she was not delivered because of that.
I guess it's interesting to me that a person can function and be charming and carry on conversations with an academic like yourself, yet then go into a trance and be owned by a demon.
Yeah, because the demonic manifestations are not necessarily, in fact, only in rare cases, are they continuous. In other words, the demons, first of all, the demons try to hide themselves a lot. And sometimes they will only come out under a certain compulsion, say an exorcism or something. But generally, throughout history, I'm a great student of history, and I studied history in college at Princeton. And I was struck, number one, by the fact that almost all cultures have had strong beliefs, not only in evil spirits, but in possession. It's actually rare that we have a culture now which is so skeptical of it. But even around the world, most people still believe in evil spirits. So a lot of this is sort of culturally influenced. You go to a country like Haiti or Madagascar, not only does everybody believe in evil spirits, but almost everybody has a story about someone who's been affected by that. So, the long and the short of it is that a lot depends on sort of not only what people do, but then once they get attacked and realize they are attacked, then it depends on what whether they renounce their lifestyle and turn to our Lord. In terms of the continuity or not of the possessed phenomena, it varies greatly. I started to say that throughout history, evil spirits have attempted to confuse people, and they've done a very good job of it. A lot of cultures have been confused about it. It really was the Jewish thinkers before the time of Jesus Christ who began to figure out that these were fallen angels. Christians as well as Muslims, influenced, in my view, by Judaism and Christianity, do believe that these spirits are fallen angels. So large segments of humanity have that belief. But other cultures may well believe in evil spirits, but think that they're dead souls or heroes from the past or something like that. And the reason they think that often is because during the possessions in those cultures, the demons lie. They pretend they are gods, goddesses, evil spirit, dead souls, people that the person knows. What's been interesting to me, and I think trying to think it through rigorously, is that I have attended, obviously I'm not an exorcist, but I've been to many exorcisms as an observer. And what I noticed, Mr. Parker, is that, first of all, the demons often reveal themselves only reluctantly. It's only under the command of the exorcist. Sort of, I command you to tell me who you are and stuff. And even in those exorcisms, they often lie for a while. They may say, well, I'm Judas Christ, I'm Judas Iscariot, or, I'm Nero. I've heard things like that. I've also heard them call themselves Zeus, by the way. But under the influence of a successful exorcism, where they're commanded by the exorcist, could be a Protestant minister as well as a Catholic priest, for instance, they eventually are forced against their will to reveal who they are. And it's at that point that reluctantly they give a demonic name. So it's another sort of piece of the puzzle that makes me convinced that certainly the mainstream monotheistic religious belief that these are fallen angels who can possess human beings is accurate.
I was going to ask you about this subject of demons lying and this whole idea of hidden knowledge being revealed by the possessed person via the demon. And I know many people who practice these arts, but I guess what I'm getting at is you would never know for sure if the information that you're receiving, whether you be a medium or a clairvoyant, is this coming from who I'm telling people it's coming from and who I think it's coming from, or is it coming from a demonic entity?
Yeah, I think it's a dicey pursuit
Yeah.
to seek this hidden knowledge, and I've seen a lot of people who do that, and I think are fooled. The whole spiritualist movement, which was extremely powerful around the turn of the previous century, there were millions of people who were regarding themselves as followers of spiritualism. I think a lot of them were playing with much darker forces than they thought.
Yes, agreed. I'm going to jump ahead because one of the things that I wanted to ask, we talked about the Satanic Panic earlier, and that was during the 80s where, we saw ritual abuse and stories, and people were worried about heavy metal records and various things. But right now, I was going to ask you about something. There is another kind of Satanic Panic in that there is a wide belief amongst many, and I don't doubt that some of these people are really rotten. However, there is a belief that there are many celebrities, the elite, politicians who are Satanists and worse, pedophiles. And I was wondering if you had thoughts on that.
Well, I think exaggerations. I mean, I think given your background in studying conspiratorial thinking. The human mind is subject to that.
Yeah.
And we sometimes want simplistic explanations for complex phenomena. So yes, we talked about the Satanic Panic of the 70s and 80s as a phenomena. In some ways, that has not entirely gone away.
Right.
And there are people who see Satanists where they probably don't exist, or exaggerate tales about pedophiles or nefarious politicians. Now, I'm not a huge fan of politicians,
Me either.
and there can be a certain amount of corruption and scuzziness in politicians, but famous scientist once said, "Don't necessarily ascribe malice to human stupidity."
Yeah.
There's a lot of limitations in human nature that can be better explained by fallen human nature rather than some kind of conspiracy.
The reason I wanted to ask that is because doing the subject matter that I do, this subject comes up a lot. And I don't doubt that there's really terrible people in all of these various things. I just don't know it is as predominant as some people would like to think it is. And it reminds me of the Satanic Panic of the 70s and the 80s.
No, I'm on board with what you're saying. I mean, there are evil people.
Yeah.
Doesn't necessarily mean they're Satanists, but there are a few of these rare Satanists around too. It's just that people have to keep a sense of perspective. It's not like they're hiding on every corner, or all cases, say, of pedophilia, which is a problem, needless to say, around the world, are necessarily being committed by some kind of vast political conspiracy.
Right. Agreed. Your story is going to be put out by Blumhouse, and I hope I'm saying that correctly. They're a huge horror company in Hollywood. They did The Purge, they did Paranormal Activity. So I congratulate you on the fact that they're going to, and as a person who deals with media and pop culture, Julia, and your book, I absolutely see it. It sounds like a great idea for a film. Me personally, I get a little bit creeped out by those things. So my wife and I are thumbing through Netflix the other night, and one of the most popular films that's out right now is The Pope's Exorcist with Russell Crowe. And of course, probably the most famous Exorcist movie ever is The Exorcist. And I guess you, who have actually been in exorcisms, just compare and contrast what it's really like versus some of the sensationalism that we see in the pop culture version of that.
Well, I knew before he died a couple of years ago, I knew Father Amorth, and Russell Crowe's portrayal is kind of interesting in a campy type of way, but its story itself is completely...
We didn't watch the film, by the way. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
The story itself is completely ridiculous, and I do not recommend that movie. As they used his name, so to speak. I guess they got some kind of permission from somebody, I don't know who, and then they built this completely sensationalist story around that. The original Exorcist was more complicated. It was widely believed that it was very loosely based. First of all, it was a work of fiction, but it was widely believed that William Peter Blatty based it on a case of a 13-year-old boy who's been identified in more recent years. He also died about a year ago, and Blatty died recently too. That case was from Maryland, and I think was credibly possessed and was delivered by Jesuits in St. Louis. And there were a lot of paranormal phenomena that surrounded the case. Now, there remains a controversy about the case, whether he was really possessed. I've read parts of the diary that the priest made, and to me it's convincing, but it doesn't convince everybody. Interestingly, Blatty himself, I'm not sure if he did this for certain reasons, maybe legal reasons. He denied that the movie was based on that case, although it was widely known that he was familiar with that case, and then decided to make the movie about a fictional young person, in this case, a girl in the movie. He clearly had read a book. I mean, I know this for a fact. There was a German sort of professor about 100 years ago who was both an historian and a psychologist and a believer in parapsychology, by the way, who collected stories about possessions throughout all history. And he had thousands of references. And I know that Blatty read that book. And so he incorporated certain elements of past exorcisms, again, some of which I'm familiar with historically, into the movie as well. It was an entertaining movie, and of course, it had a great cultural impact.
Yes.
As a whole, it was, in my opinion, it was obviously, though, fictional.
In your personal experience, because we're going to wrap up here in a minute, and I want to get your final thoughts as well, but what is the most remarkable thing that you have witnessed in an exorcism that would be, I guess, paranormal, inexplicable?
Well, I think if you're talking about a recurring phenomena, the most remarkable thing is foreign languages. I mean, I studied classics at Princeton. I know ancient Latin. I know Greek. I spent some time when I was younger playing basketball and teaching in France, so I know French. And I am struck that demons, who are very intelligent, by the way, seem to understand and be able to speak all languages. So when I've heard languages in coming out of the mouth of someone who never studied any of the languages, and maybe was not even particularly educated, I am struck that you're dealing with some kind of paranormal experience. I mean, I'll give you an example. I was at a exorcism in the middle of the country, not far from Texas, where a woman who knew no language other than English began speaking. Again, I was an observer. Began speaking what seemed to me a vaguely Slavic language, and those of us who were observers, sort of assisting, had no idea what was going on when the demon was speaking this language. And until after the exorcism stopped that day, and we asked the priest, and we said to the priest, "Do you know what language was being spoken?" And he said, "Yes, she was speaking Bulgarian, because my family is originally from Bulgaria, and I understand Bulgarian. No one else could understand it." And when the woman, after the exorcism, came around to her more ordinary state, she not only had no recollection of having spoken that language, she said, "I don't even know where Bulgaria is on the map," And so it's experience like that are quite striking. Probably the most disconcerting experience I have was the night before I met Julia. In my bedroom, my wife and I were sleeping soundly, and we had two well-behaved cats who all of a sudden started viciously attacking each other. We had to separate them. Now, I had no idea that I was going to be introduced the next day to this character, Julia. And strange to say, the exorcist that I mentioned before was so concerned about the case that he actually brought this woman to my house. I later told him, "Listen, Father Jacques, as I call him in the book, I said, please don't bring Satanists to my neighborhood."
100%.
But the first thing out of Julia's mouth I'd never met her before. The first thing out of her mouth the next morning after this incident with the cats was, "So, Dr. Gallagher, how did you like those cats last night?" So yeah, those are spooky things, and my reaction was more annoyance than super apprehension. I did tell her that look, I was asked by the clergy to evaluate her. However, if something like that occurred, I couldn't deal with her. She never apologized, but she did afterwards treat me, let's say, more respectfully.
I that is a truly remarkable story in the book, and that is the one that they're developing into the film, correct? Or is it
The,
a multiple stories?
the case of that woman will be the heart of the movie. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, she makes a fascinating character, and she's incredibly tragic. And I mean, you've already said she does not get delivered, and you believe that she's now dead, correct?
Yeah, she told me she was dying of cancer.
Yeah. All right. Well, I know you're a very busy man. I want to give you the opportunity. Are there additional thoughts for my audience that are on your mind that need to be conveyed? Because this is a fascinating subject. I would love to speak with you again.
I don't want people to be overly overwrought about this type of thing. I mean, it's not something that just happens out of the blue. The patients I've seen in my life, it's not like I've ever told anybody, oh, by the way, sir, you have no idea, but you're possessed. These cases that I'm talking about are people who are sent to me who already have some suspicion that maybe something paranormal is going on in their life. The other thing I just want to emphasize is when we make these discernments or diagnoses, I mean, in a way, we're talking about a syndrome. You have to keep a balance, because you have to, number one, look at the totality of the case. There are odd things that happen to scattered people, but you're looking for the totality of the evidence for a case, and that these are very rigorous, at least in the Catholic Church generally. These are very rigorous discernments, where nobody is just intuiting
Right.
this. So I would like to think that, I keep my scientific hat on. I'm a strong believer in science, and I'm committed to science. But just because something seems to contradict some of the laws of science and is in the realm of odd or even paranormal experience, that doesn't necessarily mean it's not accurate. And that's why I wrote the book.
Well, I appreciate your time. Ladies and gentlemen, the book is Demonic Foes, My 25 Years as a Psychiatrist Investigating Possessions, Diabolic Attacks, and the Paranormal. When is the film going to be out, do you think?
Well, as you know, there's a strike in Hollywood at the moment, so I think it's
True.
delaying things. I think within maybe 2 years or so.
Well, I think it will probably be a big hit. Blumhouse does good work, and this is a very popular and timely subject, so I'm sure that it's going to do very well. And your book has done very well. I mean, all a person has to do is go to Amazon and see how many reviews you have, and I believe it was #1 in Satanism and Demonology. I think that's what it said at the top on Amazon.
Yeah, I've been translated already into several languages. There's really interest around the world in this thing. Jason Blum, the head of
Blumhouse.
Blumhouse, using Hollywood lingo, said it was the best intellectual property he had ever seen. So I am executive producer. I do hope we're able to make a very credible movie,
Good.
which is my main aim.
Yeah. No, I think with you as an executive producer, and I mean, you don't have to make anything up. If ladies and gentlemen, if you only read one chapter of the book, read that. I mean, it's formidable and pretty horrifying in some ways. But let's leave it on a hopeful note. Of the exorcisms that you have been involved with, or by and large, I know that you're part of this association of exorcists. What is the percentage of, let's say, success, for lack of a better word, or deliverance for the person versus the people who are not?
It's very high. I mean,
Good.
I put it that way. It's very high if the person cooperates, because I don't want people to be left with the idea that exorcism is some kind of magic ceremony. You say the right mumbo jumbo and the problem is solved. we do believe that the prayers in the case of an exorcism, the prayers of a church asking for the deliverance by God or our Lord are very powerful, but the person also has to work at it themselves. As I emphasized, this just doesn't happen without the cooperation and in many ways the spiritual development of the person, which is speculated one reason why our Lord allows these things to happen, because ultimately a lot of the individual victims um, do deepen their faith and their mature spirituality.
Well, what you just said makes sense to me. And if you look at a person suffering from substance abuse or it's not a magic bullet. You've got to be willing to do that work. So that makes sense to me. Dr. Gallagher, thank you so much for your time. I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for the interview and a thoughtful set of questions.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to today's interview. My name is Michael Parker. If you enjoy this content, please recommend it to your friends, give us a rating or a review or a like, and subscribe on your podcast of choice. Until next time, as always, keep your heart and your mind open. Peace.